Today we are looking at the actual anatomy of civilizational collapse. We're doing a deep dive into the 16th and 17th lectures of Ghulam Ahmed Parwez, and what he does is he takes verses 26.20 to 202 of the Quran and reads them not as some kind of religious sermon, but really as a masterclass in systems engineering and, well, the physics of societal survival.
Yeah, it is really a remarkable piece of scholarship. I mean, Parwez was this prominent 20th century philosopher and Islamic modernist who lived right through the partition of India. And he basically dedicated his entire life to stripping away centuries of, theological sentimentality.
Right, the mysticism and the imperial overlay.
Exactly. He wanted to strip all that from these texts. So instead of viewing them through this lens of ritualistic religion, he applied a strictly sociological, rational, and linguistic framework to the root Arabic.
Which really brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. Because we are entirely avoiding the theological lens. No ancient religious sentimentality, no angry deities throwing lightning bolts from the clouds.
None of that, yeah.
We are analyzing this text purely as a precise diagnostic manual for how human systems, whether you're looking at a global economic market, a corporate boardroom, or an entire civilization, how they insulate themselves from reality and what mathematically happens when they do.
And, this matters to you listening because the mechanics of systemic failure, they just don't change. Like whether you are analyzing a modern financial crisis or managing a team, understanding this physics of societal dysfunction is basically the ultimate shortcut.
It really is. It gives you the ability to see the collapse before the structural fractures are even visible to the general public. It's the anatomy of a crash.
It is. But let me push back on that premise right out of the gate. Right. Because we are talking about an ancient text, right, compiled in the 7th century, claiming it operates as a literal diagnostic manual for modern systems engineering or macroeconomic collapse. I mean, that sounds a lot like retroactive pattern matching. Are we just, projecting modern sociology onto a document meant for an ancient audience? I get that. And that is the exact skepticism Parwez anticipated. But his counterargument rests entirely on the linguistics of the classical Arabic language. The root words used in these verses, they aren't abstract or ethereal.
Or mystical.
Right, not mystical at all. They are brutally physical, mechanical, agricultural even. Parwez argued that the original language of the text was inherently sociological. But as empires grew and co-opted the religion, the language was softened.
Softened into a passive theology that wouldn't threaten the ruling class.
Exactly. So we aren't projecting modern systems engineering backward. We are actually recovering the original mechanical precision of the text.
Okay, that reframes things significantly. So if the language is mechanically precise, we need to look at the exact words. Let's examine the specific passage Parwez zeroes in on. It's Surah 26, verses 200 through 202. I'll just read the phonetic Arabic to get the terminology on the table.
Go for it.
So it's كَذَلِكَ سَلَكْنَاهُ فِي قُلُوبِ الْمُجْرِمِينَ لَيُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ حَتَّى يَرَوْا عَذَابَ أَلِيمٍ فَيَأْتِيَهُم بَغْتَةً وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ.
And if you open a standard English translation today, you will usually find a reading that's just dripping with that very theological sentimentality we're talking about.
Right.
It generally reads something like, "Thus we have passed it through the hearts of the criminals. They will not believe in it until they see the painful punishment, and it will come to them suddenly while they are unaware."
Yeah, and that conventional reading makes human beings entirely passive participants in a cosmic play. It suggests there's a deity who just gets angry, magically hardens the hearts of the bad guys as a penalty, and then, drops a piano on their heads out of nowhere.
A completely supernatural interpretation.
Exactly, which defies any rational systems analysis.
Which is exactly why Parwez completely dismantles it. In these 2 lectures, he applies a hyper-rational approach. These 3 verses are not a threat of divine wrath. They are actually describing a specific, observable cognitive mechanism.
A mechanism of insulation.
Right. They outline the anatomy of epistemological insulation, basically how a system cuts itself off from corrective feedback and the inevitable structural consequence of that insulation.
Let's focus on that concept of suddenness, because that really seems to be where the traditional translation completely misses the mark. The word used in the verse is batan, which translates to suddenly or unexpectedly.
Yeah.
And the superstitious reading assumes this means supernatural speed, like a lightning bolt traveling at Mach 10.
Right, but Parwez points out that Bothan is not describing the velocity of an external object. It is describing the epistemological blind spot of an insulated system. It describes the subjective experience of a group of people who have basically systematically disabled their own ability to process warning signals.
So I want to make sure I grasp the real-world application of this. Think about the banking executives leading up to the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, perfect example.
Or the leadership at a legacy corporation right before bankruptcy. When the collapse happens, they inevitably go on television and claim nobody could have seen it coming.
Right. They call it an unpredictable black swan event.
Exactly. They experience the crash as happening suddenly.
But from the outside, financial analysts who hadn't turned off their institutional radar, they saw the math failing for years. Like, the subprime mortgage data was publicly available. The systemic rot was entirely measurable.
So the collapse is only sudden from inside the bubble.
Yes. If you deliberately disable your altitude sensors and put blackout curtains over the windshield of an airplane, the mountain you crash into is going to seem to appear suddenly.
Right, but the mountain didn't move.
Exactly. The mountain didn't move. Your system was just epistemologically blind to it.
The crash is mathematically predictable from the outside, but experienced as a sudden shock from the inside. That perfectly captures the distinction between objective reality and a subjective blind spot.
It really does.
But, this raises a fundamental question. How does a group of highly educated, powerful people, the ones running the global markets or the governments, get so insulated that they turn off their own radar? Surely self-preservation would compel them to look at the data, right?
Well, to understand how human systems actively choose blindness, we have to follow Parwez into this rigorous linguistic deep dive of the root words used in the text. So he unpacks the phrase, "Salaknahu fi qubihim," conventionally translated as, "we have passed it through their hearts," or their cognitive apparatus.
Okay.
The operative verb here is salaka.
Let's pause on salaka. What does that literally mean in the root Arabic? Because passed it through sounds a bit vague.
It does. In classical Arabic, salaka means to thread something through a passage. The specific physical imagery used by ancient Arabs was threading a string through a pearl.
Oh, wow. Like stringing a necklace.
Exactly. The string goes in one end, it passes entirely through the center, and it comes out the other end. It doesn't merge with the pearl, it doesn't alter the internal structure of the pearl, nor does it leave a mark on the inside. It simply passes through without engaging.
So the text is stating that the rational social code, the objective truth, the corrective feedback, passes right through the cognitive apparatus of the ruling class without catching.
Yes.
It enters their awareness and exits without altering their behavior at all. And crucially, Parwez notes that the verses immediately preceding this one establish that this code is precise, it's cross-verifiable, and completely accessible.
So it isn't a failure of communication.
Right, the signal is crystal clear.
The signal is clear, but their cognitive architecture is deliberately built to deflect it. And to understand the motivation behind building such a defective architecture, we have to look at the exact label the text applies to these people. The text calls them the mujrimin.
And I have heard that word translated 1,000 times simply as criminals or sinners. Are you saying the translation is fundamentally flawed?
It is, it's worse than flawed. It actively obscures the socioeconomic diagnosis. Sinner carries all this baggage of an individual sitting in a pew feeling guilty about a personal moral failing or missing a ritual prayer. That is entirely divorced from the root meaning.
So what's the root?
Parwez takes us back to the foundational letters, JRM. Physically, to the ancient Arabs, this root meant to cut off or to sever. In an agricultural context, it was used to describe plucking a tree completely bare of its fruit, or shearing a sheep right down to the bone so there's not a single strand of wool left.
That is a violently extractive metaphor. It's not about personal morality at all. It is a brutal economic descriptor, plucking the fruit bare, shearing the sheep to the bone.
Right. It connects epistemological blindness directly to socio-economic exploitation. The mujrimin are the elite class. They are the systemic exploiters who shear the masses to the bone. They monopolize resources, privatize public wealth, and just extract the fruit of the working class's labor.
So if we synthesize those two concepts, the severing of the sheep's wool and the cognitive threading of the pearl, it paints this incredibly cohesive picture. They are termed severed, not because a deity cut them off, but because they have actively severed the feedback loop between the corrective signal of reality and their own decision-making process.
They have to.
Right. If you are making billions of dollars by shearing the population to the bone, You cannot allow your brain to process the data that says the population is starving and the ecosystem is collapsing. Your business model basically requires you to ignore the structural damage you are causing.
The maintenance of their power demands a cognitive bypass. Now, someone might argue that if the mathematical modeling shows a society is on the brink of collapse, the elites would, engage with that data to save themselves.
You would think so.
But that assumes the elites view their survival as tied to the broader system's health. Often, their short-term extractive goals totally override long-term systemic stability.
Let me introduce an analogy to clarify this cognitive bypass because it can sound a bit abstract. Think about the spam filter on a modern email server.
Oh, I like this.
When you receive a piece of spam, it is not a failure of your computer's hardware to receive the data packet. The data arrives perfectly from the sender to the server.
Right, the inputs are there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, your system has an active written rule to route that specific type of information straight into a hidden folder. The email passes through the server at Salaka. It threads the needle without ever hitting your inbox or triggering a notification.
That maps perfectly onto Parwez's concept of the severed feedback loop. The Mujrimin have constructed a psychological and institutional spam filter. The objective truth threatens their profit margins, their social standing, and the narratives that justify their power.
So they just filter it out?
Yeah, therefore, the system hasn't failed to receive the warning from the economists, the scientists, or the working class. It has actively written a systemic rule to route those warnings into the void. They protect their exploitation by disabling their ability to perceive its ultimate consequences.
But if the executives in the boardroom have successfully routed all the red flashing lights to the spam folder, what is the mechanical process that leads to the final crash?
This brings us to what we can call the engine of reason, or the tyranny of unproven assertions. Parwez lays out a rigorous four-step causal chain found in these three verses.
The causal chain maps flawlessly onto failure cascades in modern systems engineering. So, step one is the transmission of the code. The objective data, the rational warning that the societal operating system is unsustainable, it actually arrives at the receptors of the society.
Okay, and step two involves the Mujrimin, the exploitative elite allowing it to pass through unengaged. The Salaka mechanism activates. The data is routed to spam because processing it would require dismantling their extractive wealth models. Exactly. Then, step three details their condition. Because they refuse to process the evidence, they will not engage with reality until the Athab Alim, the painful consequence, physically materializes. They will not believe the bridge is structurally unsound until they feel the sensation of falling into the river.
And finally, step four. The consequence arrives batan, suddenly, because they are la yashurun. That Arabic phrase translates to, they are not perceiving or they are unaware. They are entirely unmonitoring their own state.
And not monitoring their own state is the crucial failure point. A system with inputs but a rigged processing architecture is just blind, and Parwez's sociological analysis of how they rig this architecture is really devastating. He points out that an exploitative system doesn't just ignore reality, it drafts complex legal and intellectual frameworks to justify its own dysfunction.
Right, they legalize it.
Yeah, it creates an entire apparatus to legalize the plunder. Parwez specifically focuses on how intellectuals and economists, the high priests of the modern era, basically create theoretical frameworks to legitimize systemic usury, which is referred to in the text as riba.
I am so glad you brought up riba because I always struggle with the conventional understanding of it. Usually, riba is simply translated as interest, right?
Yeah.
And it is treated as a flat, arbitrary religious prohibition. It's presented in the exact same category as dietary restrictions.
Which totally misses the point.
Right, but Parwez frames it as the ultimate mathematical delusion, like a foundational error in how a society calculates reality. How does charging interest equate to a systemic delusion?
Well, Parwez argues that the intellectuals of an insulated system create the illusion that money can reproduce organically. They build an entire economic paradigm on compound interest, making it appear as though wealth is being generated simply by capital existing.
But in physical reality, wealth generation requires physical labor, raw materials, and time.
Exactly. A number in a ledger cannot eat, sweat, or build.
So the economic elites are basically performing a sleight of hand. They point to a growing bank account and claim wealth is multiplying out of thin air. But what they are actually doing is siphoning the nation's baseline wealth, the actual physical labor of the working class, and the finite resources of the environment into their own portfolios to match the artificial growth of their ledgers.
They are legally shearing the sheep to the bone to make the math work.
And this is how a system legalizes its own toxicity. When you build the laws of your society around an extractive, impossible mathematical model, you just lose the ability to monitor the actual health of your civilization. You mistake the word legal for the word sustainable.
That's such a good way to put it. The elites look at their spreadsheets, verify that the legal frameworks they themselves drafted are being followed, and then conclude that the system is operating at peak efficiency.
They mistake the map for the territory?
Precisely.
If the map says there is no cliff, they will drive straight over the edge, regardless of what the windshield is showing them.
Yeah, so when the accumulated consequences of all that unprocessed dysfunction finally materialize, when the working class is utterly depleted, when infrastructure crumbles from underinvestment, when the economy seizes up because the baseline resources are exhausted, the system cries foul.
Of course they do.
The elites experience these entirely mathematical outcomes as external shocks. They blame foreign powers, they blame the laziness of the poor, they blame bad luck.
Because if you have legally codified the fraud, your internal monitoring system will always report a clean bill of health. The crash must be an unpredictable asteroid from space. But from the outside, looking at the objective data, it is just gravity.
It's just gravity.
Which transitions us to the core mechanism of the crash itself. If the collapse isn't a divine lightning bolt, and it certainly isn't bad luck, what exactly is it? Parwez introduces the law of requital.
Right. In Urdu, Parwez refers to this as mukafat-i-amal, the law of requital. And he applies it with absolute structural precision. The community that ignores the corrective signal does not receive a supernatural punishment. God does not step out from behind a curtain and smite them.
Right.
Instead, the community simply experiences the physical, unyielding accumulation of its own unprocessed decisions.
It is the natural social physics of dysfunction accumulation. I mean, if I build a house out of rotting wood and I ignore the structural engineer who hands me a report detailing why it will collapse, gravity isn't punishing me when the roof caves in.
No, gravity doesn't care.
Gravity has no emotional state. Gravity is just running its objective code.
That is the exact mechanism of the painful consequence the Adab-Hali mentioned in verse 201. It is just the accumulated weight of the rotting wood. If a social system runs without feedback correction for long enough, it experiences structural failures. These begin as minor correctable dysfunctions.
Like a slight rise in poverty or a dip in public health.
Right, but without a feedback loop to correct them, they compound. Eventually, they become qualitatively different. They become catastrophic and irreversible economic collapse, social upheaval, or political disintegration.
Parwez's analysis of the phrase, "until they see the painful punishment," completely shifted my perspective. I previously assumed this meant God will show them the fire in the afterlife, so they finally believe.
Well, a lot of people think that.
But Parwez posits that it means the insulated system is eventually forced to see the consequences from the inside. The bubble eventually bursts. The problem is that by the time the consequences are visible to the people who deliberately disabled the radar, it is mathematically too late to pull the airplane up.
The momentum of the crash is already locked into the physics of the system. The decision to sever the feedback loop set the trajectory long before the final impact. And this concept ties directly into Parwez's brilliant reinterpretation of the Book of Deeds, a concept frequently referenced in these texts regarding final judgment.
Let's examine that, the Book of Deeds. Because the traditional view is highly literal and, well, anthropomorphic.
Very much so.
It's usually depicted as an angel sitting on your shoulder with a giant leather-bound ledger, taking dictation on every minor infraction, just ready to read it back to you in a cosmic courtroom.
Parwez elevates the concept entirely. The Book of Deeds is not a magical ledger kept by a celestial scribe. It is the undeniable, unhackable data log of a system's own failure. Think of our airplane analogy. What is the one thing recovered after a catastrophic crash?
The black box.
Exactly, the flight data recorder. It logs every input, every disabled sensor, every ignored proximity warning.
Oh man, so when the system crashes, the log is open. You read your own output. The system is judged by the sheer weight of its own irrefutable data. The universe essentially says, here's the source code you wrote, here are the inputs you ignored, run the executable file, and the result is the crash.
The text actually says, read your own book. Today, you are sufficient as a reckoner against yourself.
You do not need a prosecuting attorney when your own data indicts you. That framework is significantly more terrifying, yet more empowering than a cosmic judge. It means reality is strictly objective. You cannot bribe the law of requital. You cannot draft a legal loophole to bypass the physics of societal collapse.
No, you can't.
Which naturally leads us to the inevitable question of intervention. If a system is mathematically doomed because the elites have disabled the feedback loops, does replacing that system require violence? Like, if the ruling class will not listen to reason, is armed revolution the only logical mechanism for correction? Parwez addresses this using the concept of facade, which generally means corruption or destructive violence.
And his counter to the idea of violent revolution is incredibly sharp. He argues that violence does not cure an epistemologically insulated system. If you execute a violent revolution to overthrow the madrumin, but you leave the underlying psychological architecture intact, you have solved absolutely nothing.
You're just trading places.
Exactly. You are simply replacing one group holding a stick with another group holding a bigger stick.
If the new revolutionaries maintain the willingness to sever the feedback loop for their own personal gain, if they still want to shear the sheep, just under a new ideological flag, they simply become the new mudrumin. You haven't changed the physics of the society, you've just rebranded the shearing machine.
True systemic change, Parwez argues, only occurs through an inner change. And to be clear, this is not some mystical inner peace. It is a psychological and rational shift where the human ego actually aligns with the objective laws of reality.
You have to reconnect the feedback loop inside your own cognitive architecture before you can sustainably reconnect it in the broader society. The revolution has to be epistemological before it can be political.
Beautifully said. And this brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire textual analysis. Verses 26.200 to 202, they do not exist in a vacuum. Parwez points out that they are the diagnostic conclusion of a massive comparative case study. The bulk of Surah 26, leading right up to these 3 verses, details 7 historical civilizations that collapsed.
7 case studies.
Right. And Parwez demonstrates how every single one of them exhibited the exact same pattern of epistemological insulation.
It is arguably the most rigorous sociological mapping in the ancient world. Let's look at the civilizations Parwez examines. They all ran variants of the same salty code. Take the civilization of Pharaoh in Egypt, engaging with Moses.
Okay.
The hallmark of Pharaoh's system was total information control and class-based filtration of data. Pharaoh literally declares, "I show you only what I see," centralizing reality itself into his own ego. It was an ultimate cognitive bypass, where the state disabled all competing feedback loops.
And then you have the people of Midian, the society of Shu'aib. Their specific systemic rot was measurement fraud and market manipulation. They legally institutionalized the tampering of weights and measures.
Right.
They created an economic paradigm where the baseline reality of a transaction was disconnected from the recorded ledger. It is the exact same Reba delusion we discussed earlier, legalizing toxicity to shear the working class, until the economic trust of the entire civilization just evaporated.
We also see the people of Ayat, who suffered from what Parwez calls the permanence delusion. They built massive, unnecessary architectural monuments to project an illusion of eternal dominance. They invested their resources into structural hubris while completely ignoring the social and environmental feedback loops that indicated their power was fragile and temporary.
And the people of Thamud, who monopolized access to the vital water sources, that's an early example of absolute resource privatization, they cut off the lifeblood of the ecosystem to maintain elite control.
Then, when you walk through Noah's people, you see strict class-based exclusion. The elites refusing to engage with objective truth simply because the working class accepted it first. Their ego couldn't handle sharing an epistemological framework with the poor.
And finally, the people of Lot, which Parwez analyzes as the total subversion of natural law and social inversion, where destructive behaviors are normalized and those who point out the dysfunction are actively exiled.
So 7 distinct historical case studies: class filtration, measurement fraud, permanence delusion, resource privatization, class exclusion, social inversion, and information control. What Parwez makes clear is that these are not isolated religious fables. They are all variants of the exact same structural dynamic, a social system that has insulated its decision-making architecture from the corrective signals provided by objective reality.
The 3 verses we've analyzed, 26.200 to 202, provide the structural mechanism that unites all 7 case studies. They provide the mechanism of salaka, where the truth passes through without engaging. They detail the community's condition, refusing to process evidence, and they outline the consequence, the baton or sudden seeming collapse from inside the bubble.
So we arrive at the final verdict on these insulated communities. It is captured in that chilling phrase from verse 202. Layasharun, they're unaware.
We must clarify this deeply because it is the crux of the entire diagnostic manual. Unaware does not mean stupid. It does not mean they lacked technological prowess or sophisticated legal systems. Pharaoh's Egypt built the pyramids. The people of Ayat were master architects.
Right, they were likely the most highly educated people in their respective societies, the intellectuals, the lawmakers, the wealthy elite.
Exactly. Unaware means the monitoring function of their societal operating system was deliberately disabled. The system lost the ability to observe its own state. It operated entirely on a self-model maintained by the systematic exclusion of contradictory evidence. And it did so in a universe where the law of requital runs regardless of whether the system's legal code acknowledges it or not.
The collapse of Pharaoh, of Midian, of Ayat, none of these were verdicts rendered by an angry deity striking from the outside. The collapse was simply the system's own accumulated, unprocessed choices arriving at their mathematically inevitable structural endpoint. It is the rotting house collapsing under its own weight.
If we accept this framework, it completely redefines the core vocabulary of the text. The distinction between a Muslim and a Mujrim has absolutely nothing to do with religious rituals, tribal affiliation, or what direction you face when you pray.
It becomes a strict definitional sociological binary. A Muslim, viewed through this analytical lens, is simply an entity, a person, a corporation, a society that actively submits its ego to objective, rational feedback loops. They align their operating system with the physical and social laws of cause and effect that sustain life. They keep their sensors on.
And a Mujrim is the entity that severs that feedback loop. The entity that exploits the system, routes the truth to the spam folder, and shears the sheep to the bone for short-term gain until the entire structure crashes. It is the difference between open-source code that is constantly patched and improved by error reporting and a closed, proprietary system that ignores its own memory leaks until the server literally catches fire.
Man, this has been an incredibly dense and paradigm-shifting analysis. We started by dismantling the myth of divine anger, proving that the universe operates on strict cause and effect. We analyzed the anatomy of the Mujrim not as a theological sinner, but as a system severer.
We really went through it all. We examined the engine of unproven assertions where elites legalized dysfunction. We mapped the law of requital, showing how ignored warnings accumulate into catastrophic collapse. And we synthesized the historical case studies to arrive at the terrifying state of la yashurun, systemic blindness.
The diagnosis is completely clear.
Yeah.
Systems crash because the people running them deliberately filter out reality to protect their extraction. But the law of requital cannot be bypassed.
It just can't.
So if we accept Parwez's premise that this is the objective physics of how massive civilizational systems insulate themselves and eventually collapse, what does that mean for us on a micro level? Look at your own career. Look at your own business, your daily habits, your leadership style. Where are you acting as the Mujrim? Where have you actively severed your own feedback loops to protect your ego or your short-term comfort? Because wherever you are routing the truth to your spam folder, you are quietly building a house out of rotting wood, setting yourself up for a sudden crash that everyone outside your bubble can already see coming. Keep your feedback loops open, stay curious, and never turn off your radar. Catch you on the next deep dive.